I've been caring for the same Bigfoot since 1984. What he finally showed me about why his kind fears humans is something that will stay with me until my last breath. Some people might think I've lost my mind for sharing this, but after 40 years of keeping this secret, I believe someone needs to know the truth before it's too late. Before we're both gone and the story dies with us. I'm in my 70s now, living alone in the same remote cabin in the Pacific Northwest Mountains where this all began. My husband passed away in the early 80s, leaving me with this property and a lifetime of memories. I grew up in these mountains, learned to hunt and fish and survive from my father, so being alone out here never frightened me. I made my living through a small garden, some woodworking I sold in town, and the peace that comes from a simple life surrounded by forest. Winter came hard in 1984. The first big storm hit in late November, dumping 3 feet of snow in 2 days and cutting me off from the outside world for weeks. I had plenty of supplies, a good wood stove, and enough to keep me busy. On the 3rd night of the storm, I heard something outside. Not the usual sound of branches breaking under snow or wind howling through the trees. This was different. Heavy, deliberate movement near my woodshed. The next morning, I bundled up and went out to investigate. The tracks I found in the fresh snow stopped my heart. They were massive, easily 17 inches long and 7 or 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions. They led from the tree line straight to my woodshed, then veered off toward the forest again. I followed them, my rifle slung over my shoulder, more for comfort than protection. About 100 yards into the trees, I found him. A massive creature, easily 8 feet tall, even collapsed in the snow, covered in dark brown fur that was matted with ice and blood. At first, my mind tried to make it something else. A bear, a person in furs, anything that made sense. But as I got closer, there was no denying what I was seeing. His left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken or badly injured. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. He was dying. His eyes opened when I was about 20 feet away, dark, intelligent eyes that locked onto mine with a mix of fear and resignation. He didn't try to move, didn't threaten me. He was too weak. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. I saw something in those eyes that changed everything. Not an animal looking at me. A person, someone who understood he was at my mercy and had accepted whatever came next. I went back to the cabin and stood in my kitchen for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Every logical part of my brain said to leave it alone, let nature take its course, maybe even call someone. But I kept seeing those eyes, the understanding in them, the quiet acceptance of death. Something in me couldn't walk away from that. I thought about my late husband, about what he would have done. He'd always had a soft spot for injured creatures, would bring home birds with broken wings or deer that had been hit by cars, try to nurse them back to health. Most of the time they died anyway, but sometimes they survived, and those successes meant everything to him. He would have helped this creature without hesitation, I realized. He would have seen past the impossible nature of it to the simple fact of suffering that could be eased. So I made my choice, not because it was logical or safe, but because it was right, because turning my back on a dying being, any being, would have made me someone I didn't want to be. I gathered supplies and headed back out into the snow. I loaded up a sled with blankets, food, and a thermos of hot broth. It took me 3 trips to get everything out there. He watched me the whole time, never moving, barely reacting. On my first approach, I left the food about 15 feet away and backed off, then 10 feet, then 5. By the 4th trip, I was close enough to drape a blanket over his massive shoulders. His fur was coarse under my hands, and I could feel him trembling from cold and pain. That first day, I stayed until sunset, just sitting nearby, letting him get used to my presence. I talked to him like I would talk to anyone, told him about the cabin, about my husband, about the mountains. His eyes followed me, and sometimes his head would tilt slightly, like he was trying to understand the words. When I left that evening, I promised I'd come back in the morning. The next few weeks established a routine. Every morning and evening, I'd make the trek out with food, fresh blankets, and whatever supplies I thought might help. I brought vegetables from my root cellar, dried meat, fish I'd smoked the previous fall. He ate slowly at first, as if testing whether the food was safe, but eventually he started eating as soon as I left it. I noticed things about him as the days passed. He was male, probably middle-aged if the graying patches in his fur were any indication. His hands were enormous but incredibly dexterous, with thick fingers that could manipulate the food I brought with surprising delicacy. His face was a strange mix of human and ape, with a pronounced brow ridge but eyes that were unmistakably aware, thinking. After the first week, I started trying to help with his leg. I brought bandages and a splint I'd fashioned from cedar branches. The first time I touched the injury, he tensed up and I thought he might lash out. But he just watched me, breathing hard through the pain as I worked. The leg was bad, probably broken weeks before I found him and healed wrong. There wasn't much I could do except stabilize it and hope. I built a shelter around him using branches and a tarp, something to protect him from the worst of the wind and snow. He watched me work, and once, when I was struggling with a particularly heavy branch, he reached out and steadied it for me. That was the first time we worked together. The first time I understood this was going to be more than just me helping an injured animal. Spring came slowly that year, but when it did, he started moving around more. First just shifting positions, then standing with the help of a tree, eventually taking careful steps. His leg would never be right, I could see that. He walked with a noticeable limp, favoring the injured side, but he could walk, and that was more than I'd hoped for when I first found him. What surprised me was that he didn't leave. Even when he could clearly travel again, when the snow melted and the forest opened up, he stayed near my property. Some mornings I'd look out and see him sitting at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin. Other times I'd find signs that he'd been closer during the night, footprints near the woodshed or the garden fence. At first, I wondered if he stayed because he couldn't hunt properly with his injured leg. But as I watched him move through the forest over the following weeks, I realized he was perfectly capable of surviving on his own. He could fish, forage, climb trees despite the limp. No, he was staying by choice. He'd found something here that he valued more than solitude, more than the safety of deep wilderness. He'd found companionship, maybe the first safe companionship he'd known since losing his family. I continued bringing food, and he continued accepting it, but something new started happening. He began leaving things for me. Small gifts, I suppose you could call them, interesting stones, perfectly round or with unusual colors, pieces of wood that had been worn smooth by water. Once, a handful of wild strawberries arranged on a flat rock near where I usually left his food. He was reciprocating, communicating in the only way he knew how. Over the following months and years, we developed a routine that became as natural as any other part of my life. Morning feeding, evening feeding, occasional encounters in the forest where we'd sit near each other in comfortable silence. He learned to recognize the sound of my footsteps, and I learned to read his body language when he was relaxed, when something had disturbed him, when he was in pain from his leg. The mid-'80s became the '90s, and our relationship deepened in ways I never could have imagined. He wasn't just surviving near my cabin, he was choosing to be there. Choosing my company over the solitude of the deep forest. I realized I was less alone than I'd been since my husband died. This strange, impossible companion had become as much a part of my life as morning coffee or evening chores. He helped me sometimes in his own way. When a storm knocked a huge branch onto my roof, I woke up the next morning to find it moved off to the side, dragged away by something with incredible strength. When I was stacking firewood one autumn, struggling with the larger pieces, he emerged from the trees and spent an afternoon moving the heavy logs for me. He never came too close to the cabin itself, maintaining a boundary I'd never asked for but appreciated. The few neighbors I had, scattered across miles of mountain property, sometimes asked questions. Why was I buying so much extra food when I lived alone? Why did I take such long walks into the forest? I told them I was feeding deer, composting, foraging. They seemed to accept it, or at least stopped asking. The secret became part of my daily reality, something I carried without really thinking about the weight of it anymore. I learned his preferences through trial and error. He loved apples above almost anything else, would eat them core and all. Salmon was a favorite, especially when it was fresh. He seemed less interested in bread or grains, preferring fruits, vegetables, nuts, and meat. His tastes were more human than I'd expected, another small detail that reminded me he was something between categories, something unique. I noticed other things too, small details that built up over time into a fuller picture of who he was. He was meticulous about cleanliness, often washing food in the stream before eating it. He had favorite spots in the forest, places he'd return to again and again. One was a large, flat rock overlooking a valley where he'd sit for hours just watching the world below. Another was a grove of old-growth cedars where the canopy was so thick that hardly any light reached the ground. He seemed to find peace in these places, a brief respite from the constant vigilance his survival required. He was also playful sometimes in ways that surprised me. Once I arrived to find him stacking rocks into elaborate towers, balancing them with incredible precision. When he saw me watching, he knocked them down and started over, like a child who'd been caught doing something silly. Another time, I found him sitting by the stream, dropping leaves into the current and watching them float away. These moments of lightness were rare but precious, reminders that despite everything he had endured, there was still capacity for simple joy. The seasons became markers in our relationship. Spring meant fresh greens and the return of salmon to the streams. His favorite time of year, summer, brought berries and long days when we'd sometimes sit together until twilight. Fall was preparation time, when I'd bring extra food to help him build reserves for winter. And winter was when it had all begun, when I'd found him dying in the snow. Every winter reminded me of that first meeting, of the choice I'd made that changed both our lives. As the years accumulated, I started thinking of time differently, not in terms of months or years, but in terms of seasons with him. The winter, he helped me fix my roof. The spring, when a bear wandered too close and he scared it off with vocalizations I'd never heard before. The summer, when wildflowers bloomed so thick that even our meeting spot was carpeted in color. The fall, when he showed me a hidden apple tree deep in the forest, its fruit small but incredibly sweet. These memories became the landmarks of my life. I talked to him more than I talked to any human during those years, about everything and nothing, about my late husband, about my childhood, about dreams I'd had and opportunities I'd missed, about the changing world, the way development was creeping ever closer to the mountains, the way people seemed to have less and less respect for the wilderness. He'd listen, his head tilted slightly, his eyes focused on my face. I had no idea how much he understood, but the listening itself seemed important to him. Maybe he was as lonely as I was. Maybe my voice was as much a comfort to him as his presence was to me. Everything changed in the late 90s. I remember it was autumn, the leaves turning gold and red, the air crisp with the promise of winter. I arrived at our usual meeting spot with a basket of food to find him pacing back and forth, agitated in a way I'd never seen before. He was making low sounds in his chest, almost like growling, but not quite. His eyes were wide, scanning the forest constantly. When I approached, he moved toward me quickly, something he rarely did. He gestured toward the deeper forest, making insistent noises, clearly wanting me to follow. I'd never seen him so distressed. My heart started pounding, wondering what could frighten something so large and powerful. But I trusted him, so I followed. He led me nearly a mile through dense undergrowth to a spot I'd never been before. An old hunting camp, long abandoned, with a rusted fire ring and the remains of a lean-to shelter. But there were fresh signs too. Recent tire tracks in the dirt, new boot prints, cigarette butts that hadn't weathered yet. Someone had been here recently. He pointed to the ground with one massive finger. I looked closer and saw what had him so upset. Spent shell casings, at least a dozen of them, scattered around the fire ring, fresh trash, beer cans and food wrappers, and something that made my stomach turn, claw marks on the trees, deep gouges like someone had been using them for target practice. I understood then he was showing me that humans had been here, in his territory, with guns. He was trying to tell me something about danger, about the kind of people who came into these woods. I told him I'd be careful, that I'd watch for these people. But I could see in his eyes that it wasn't just about protecting me. He was afraid for himself. Over the following weeks, he showed me more locations, old trap sites with rusted steel jaws still set in the ground, places where four-wheel drive vehicles had torn up the forest floor, leaving deep ruts that scarred the landscape, areas he clearly avoided, giving them wide berth on our walks together. Each location told a story of human intrusion, of his world shrinking as our world expanded into every corner of wilderness. I started to realize he'd been living this way for years, maybe his entire life, constantly aware of where humans were, what they were doing, avoiding contact at all costs. The only reason he'd let me help him that winter was because he'd been too injured to run, too weak to maintain the distance his survival depended on. And even then, half dead in the snow, he'd been afraid. I started asking myself questions I'd avoided for years. Why was he alone? Where were others like him? Why did he stay near my cabin instead of seeking out his own kind? The answers, when they came, would break my heart. One day in early spring, maybe 15 years after I first found him, he led me deeper into the mountains than we'd ever gone together. We hiked for hours, him moving slowly because of his leg, me struggling to keep up with his pace even with the limp. He was determined, focused on something specific. Finally, we came to a waterfall I'd never seen before, a beautiful cascade tumbling down rocks covered in moss. The hike itself was grueling. We climbed steep slopes where I had to grab onto roots and rocks to pull myself up. We crossed streams where the water ran so fast and cold it numbed my feet through my boots. We pushed through thickets of mountain laurel and devil's club that left scratches on my arms. But he kept checking back, making sure I was still following, slowing his pace when I fell too far behind. Whatever he wanted to show me was important enough to risk this difficult journey. The waterfall was hidden in a narrow gorge, the kind of place you could pass within 100 yards of and never know was there. The sound of rushing water echoed off the rock walls, creating an acoustic chamber that muffled all other forest sounds. Rainbows formed in the mist where sunlight managed to penetrate the canopy. It was beautiful and isolated, the perfect place to hide something precious. He led me behind the waterfall, through the spray and onto slick rocks, to a cave entrance I never would have found on my own. The cave was shallow, maybe 30 feet deep, but dry and sheltered. And inside, carefully arranged, were bones, not animal bones. These were large, human-shaped, but far too big. Skulls with pronounced brow ridges and sagittal crests. Arm bones that would have belonged to something 8 or 9 feet tall, rib cages that could have enclosed 2 of me. They were arranged with care, almost reverence. This wasn't just a place where things had died. This was a burial site. I stood there for a long time trying to process what I was seeing. The bones were old, weathered by time, but they had been protected from the elements by the cave. Some still had traces of the ligaments that had once held them together. The skulls, each one unique in subtle ways, stared at me with empty eye sockets. I thought about the individuals they'd once belonged to. Thinking beings, feeling beings, people with lives and experiences and relationships, all gone now, reduced to bones in a hidden cave. The arrangement told a story too. The bones weren't scattered or jumbled. They were laid out with intention, each skeleton whole and positioned as if sleeping. Someone had carried these bodies here, had taken the time to position them with dignity, had said whatever goodbye their kind said to their dead. This was a sacred place, a cemetery, a memorial to those who'd been lost. I counted 7 distinct skeletons, and as I looked closer, my trained eye from years of hunting caught something that made my blood run cold. Several of the bones showed damage that was unmistakable. Bullet holes, clean punctures in skulls, shattered ribs from high-powered rounds, fractured bones from impacts that could only come from firearms. I turned to look at him, and he was already watching me, waiting to see if I understood. I did. These were his people, his family maybe, others like him who hadn't survived their encounters with humans. We sat in that cave for hours while he told me his story, not with words, but with gestures and marks drawn in the dusty floor of the cave. He drew figures, showed me through pantomime what had happened. It took time to understand, but eventually the terrible picture became clear. He started by drawing in the cave dirt, using his massive finger to create simple but effective pictures. He drew a circle to represent his family's territory, then smaller circles inside for individuals. He pointed to himself, then drew a small figure showing he'd been young. Then he drew larger figures around the small one, parents perhaps, siblings, other family members. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, making sure I understood each element before moving to the next. The tragedy unfolded in his drawings like frames in a silent film. He showed his family living peacefully, gathering food, caring for young ones. Then he drew new figures approaching, smaller than his people but numerous. He made gestures like holding a rifle, made sounds like gunshots by clapping his hands together sharply. The impact of those sounds in the enclosed cave made me jump every time. He'd had a family once, a mate, children, others who lived in these mountains. He showed me this by drawing figures of different sizes, gesturing to himself and then to the bones. He'd been young then, probably the equivalent of a teenager in human years. They'd been careful, cautious, living deep in the wilderness where humans rarely went. But one day, hunters had found them. He showed me through gestures, multiple humans with weapons. He drew the scene in the dirt, figures surrounding his family, the chaos that followed. He'd been on the edges, maybe foraging or exploring. When he heard the gunshots, he'd run back, but it was too late. He showed me how he'd been shot too, gesturing to his damaged leg. The injury that I'd found him with all those years ago wasn't from a fall or a fight with another animal. It was a bullet wound, old and poorly healed. He'd escaped by running, dragging himself through the forest, leaving his dead family behind. He'd survived, but only barely, and he'd been alone ever since. I understood then why he'd approached my cabin that winter night despite the danger. He'd been hurt, starving, and desperate. He'd taken the risk because he had nothing left to lose. And when I'd helped him instead of hurting him, it had changed something fundamental in how he saw at least one human. In the back of the cave, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, he showed me something else. A collection of human items he'd gathered over the years, old newspaper clippings, yellow and brittle with age. I carefully unfolded them, my hands shaking as I read the headlines. Bigfoot hunting expedition planned for Oregon wilderness. Reward offered for Sasquatch capture. Cryptid bounty draws dozens to national forest. The articles painted a picture of systematic hunting that I'd never imagined. Organized expeditions sponsored by wealthy individuals and even some government agencies. Bounties ranging from $10,000 to $50,000 for proof of a Sasquatch. Detailed plans for capture operations, including tranquilizer protocols and transport logistics. These weren't amateur hunters hoping to glimpse something strange in the woods. These were coordinated efforts to find and eliminate an entire species. Some articles described close calls, near captures that had failed at the last moment. Others mentioned bodies that had been recovered, then mysteriously disappeared from morgues or research facilities. There were references to government seizures, evidence being confiscated under national security provisions, witnesses being discredited or silenced. A pattern emerged of official denial combined with covert action, public dismissal masking private knowledge. The most disturbing articles were the ones that treated it like sport. Hunting guides advertising Bigfoot expeditions alongside elk and bear hunts. Trophy hunters discussing the prestige of bagging such rare game. Magazine spreads featuring heavily armed men posing in wilderness settings, promising readers they too could participate in the hunt of a lifetime. The casual dehumanization in the language, calling them beasts and monsters and targets, made my stomach turn. The articles were from the 60s and 70s, describing organized hunts, prizes offered for proof, groups of armed men heading into the wilderness specifically to kill or capture creatures like him. Some articles mentioned bodies that had been recovered but later mysteriously disappeared. Others talked about live captures by government agencies, though details were always vague. There were photographs too, grainy black and white images of men in hunting gear, grinning at the camera, rifles in hand. In the background of some photos, you could see large shapes, bodies being dragged or loaded onto trucks. The images were unclear, probably intentionally so, but the implications were horrifying. He'd collected this evidence over decades, gathering proof of what had been done to his kind, maybe as a way to remember, or maybe hoping that someday someone would see it and understand. I carefully wrapped the clippings back up, protecting them from moisture and decay. This was history that deserved to be preserved, even if it could never be shared publicly. Over the next several weeks, he showed me more burial sites. We hiked to different locations across the mountains, each containing more bones, more evidence of violence. Some sites were very old, the bones weathered and partially reclaimed by the forest. Others were more recent, relatively speaking. From what I could tell, each site represented more families, more individuals who'd been killed. The second site we visited was in a narrow canyon, accessible only by climbing down a steep rock face using tree roots as handholds. At the bottom, sheltered under an overhang, were 5 more skeletons. These ones showed different kinds of damage. Some bones had been broken by blunt force, crushed by impacts that spoke of beatings or being struck by vehicles. Others showed signs of being burned, the bone blackened and cracked from intense heat. The variety of violence was almost worse than its consistency. A third site was high on a mountain ridge, in a cave so well hidden I never would have found it even if I'd been looking. The bones here were ancient, the skulls worn smooth by time and moisture, but even these old remains showed evidence of violence. Arrow points embedded in vertebrae, stone axe marks on skulls, evidence that the hunting of his people stretched back centuries, maybe millennia. This wasn't a modern phenomenon. Humans had been killing his kind for as long as the two species had coexisted. Each site visit was emotionally exhausting. Standing in these hidden places, bearing witness to evidence of atrocities that the world would never acknowledge, took a toll. I'd return home each evening physically tired from the hiking, but emotionally devastated by what I'd seen. Some nights I'd lie awake thinking about all those individuals, all those families, all that loss, and knowing that he'd carried this knowledge alone for decades, had witnessed his own family's death, and then discovered evidence of countless others, helped me understand the depth of his trauma. He communicated through gestures that there used to be many more of his kind in these mountains. He'd show me by holding up all his fingers repeatedly, trying to express large numbers. Then he'd close his fists, open them showing fewer fingers, close them again, showing even fewer. A population declining over generations, hunted and killed and driven away until almost nothing remained. Some sites showed evidence of multiple generations being killed together. Adult bones alongside much smaller ones, children who'd never had a chance to grow up. Entire family groups wiped out in single incidents. The scope of it was staggering, and as I understood more, the weight of it became almost unbearable. I realized I was witnessing the aftermath of a genocide, not the ancient kind you read about in history books, but something recent, ongoing, happening in my lifetime. An entire species being systematically eliminated while the world either didn't know or didn't care. And the few survivors lived in constant terror, hiding in the deepest wilderness, avoiding any human contact because contact meant death. Understanding the past made the present even more frightening. He started showing me current threats, evidence that the danger hadn't passed new logging roads cutting deeper into the forest. Fresh survey markers indicating development plans, trail cameras mounted on trees by researchers or hunters or curious hikers, each one a potential exposure risk. The logging roads were particularly concerning. What had once required hours of difficult hiking could now be reached by truck in minutes. Clear cuts opened up the forest, eliminating the cover his kind needed to stay hidden. The noise of machinery and human activity drove wildlife away, destroying the ecosystem he depended on. And each new road brought more people, more chances for deadly encounters. The trail cameras were everywhere, mounted on trees throughout the forest by various groups with various motives. Wildlife researchers studying bear populations, hunters scouting for game, BIGFOOT enthusiasts hoping to catch proof. Each camera represented eyes that never blinked, mechanical witnesses that could capture what human eyes might miss. He showed me several of these cameras, pointing them out from a distance, making it clear he knew exactly where they were and how to avoid them. Development was creeping closer every year, new vacation homes being built on what had been wild land. Subdivisions eating into the forest edges, cell towers going up on mountain peaks. The wilderness that had once seemed infinite was shrinking into isolated pockets, islands of wild land in a sea of human development. And as it shrank, his options for staying hidden shrank with it. The world was closing in. Every year there were more people in the mountains, more hikers with cameras, more hunters with better equipment, more development pushing into what used to be true wilderness. His territory, the safe space he'd managed to carve out, was shrinking. And with each new intrusion, his fear grew more visible. I became more vigilant, more protective. I started posting no trespassing signs around my property. Even though I had no legal right to the forest beyond my cabin, I'd chase off hunters who got too close, telling them the area was dangerous or that I'd seen bears with cubs, anything to keep them away from where he lived. The first serious scare came in the early 2000s. A group of hunters showed up at my cabin asking permission to hunt my land. I refused immediately, but that didn't stop them. A few days later, I found evidence they'd been on the property anyway, boot prints and spent shells near where he usually stayed. I confronted them when they came back, threatening to call the sheriff. They laughed it off, but they did leave. He'd seen them too. For a week after, he wouldn't come out even for food. I'd leave his meals at our usual spot and find them untouched the next day. Eventually, he started eating again, but something had changed. He was more skittish, more careful. The encounter had reminded him that his safety was always temporary, always conditional on not being seen. Another time, a pair of hikers got lost and ended up at my cabin asking for directions. I gave them water and snacks and very specific instructions on how to get back to the main trail, a route that would take them far from his territory. But one of them mentioned seeing something large moving through the trees, something that didn't move like a bear. I told them it was probably just shadows, maybe an elk. They seemed to accept this, but my heart was pounding the entire time they were there. After they left, I found him hiding deep in the forest, pressed against a rock face, making himself as small as possible despite his size. He'd heard them talking, had gotten close enough to see them before retreating. For days after, he was nervous, jumping at every sound. The fear in his eyes during that time haunts me still. Time catches up with everyone, even beings that aren't supposed to exist. By the early 2000s, I was in my 60s and feeling it. Arthritis in my hands, knees that complained on cold mornings, the general slowing down that comes with age. He was aging too, though I had no frame of reference for what that meant for his kind. His fur had more gray in it, especially around his face. He moved even slower than his injured leg required, stopping to rest more often on our walks. I found myself thinking about mortality more as the years passed, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of practical concern. What would happen to him when I died? Would he be able to survive without the supplemental food I brought? Would he remember to be careful, to stay hidden, to avoid the dangers that had killed so many of his kind? These worries kept me up at night, made me more careful about my own health and safety than I'd been in years. But I also thought about what would happen to me when he died. The isolation I'd face, the silence where his presence had been. I'd lived alone for decades, but I hadn't been lonely, not really. He'd filled a space in my life that I hadn't even realized was empty until he was there. The thought of losing that, of returning to true solitude, was harder to bear than the thought of my own death. We adapted to our limitations together. I stopped making the long hikes into deep wilderness, and he started coming closer to the cabin. We met at spots that were easier for both of us to reach. Our meetings became shorter but more frequent, neither of us wanting to miss a day but neither able to sustain the long encounters of earlier years. It was a comfortable adjustment, two old friends making accommodations for each other's weaknesses. We were getting old together, two beings that probably shouldn't have formed a connection, bound by circumstance and years of careful trust. I started worrying about what would happen when one of us died. Would he be able to survive without the food I brought? Would I be able to live with the loneliness of his absence? These thoughts kept me up at night more than I wanted to admit. Our routine continued but adapted to our aging bodies. I made fewer trips into the deep forest and he came closer to the cabin. Some mornings I'd wake to find gifts left on my porch, his way of checking on me when I hadn't made it out to see him. Other times he'd wait at the tree line, visible from my window, until he saw me moving around inside. 3 years ago, I had a stroke. I was in the garden when it happened, dropped to my knees, and couldn't get back up. The whole left side of my body wasn't responding right. I managed to crawl inside the cabin, but couldn't make it to the phone. I lay on the floor, terrified and helpless, wondering if this was how it ended. The hours passed slowly. I drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of the sun moving across the floor through the window, aware of my body refusing to obey commands. My mind was clear enough to understand what had happened, which made it worse in some ways. I knew I needed help. Knew time was critical for stroke treatment. Knew that every hour that passed reduced my chances of full recovery. But there was nothing I could do except lie there and wait. Evening came and went. I missed our usual meeting time. I imagined him waiting at our spot, watching for me, wondering why I hadn't come. Would he think I'd abandoned him? Would he understand something was wrong? The thought of him waiting, confused and concerned, was almost worse than the physical pain and fear I was experiencing. That evening, when I didn't show up with food, he came looking for me. I heard him outside the cabin, making questioning sounds, worried. Then I saw his face at the window, those huge hands pressed against the glass, his eyes scanning until they found me on the floor. The fear I saw in his expression mirrored what I was feeling. For the next 3 days, while I slowly recovered enough strength to move, he took care of me. He'd leave food at the door, fish from the stream, berries, roots I recognized as edible. He couldn't come inside, wouldn't cross that threshold even in an emergency, but he stayed close. I'd hear him at night, moving around the cabin, standing guard. When I finally managed to get to the door and open it, I found him sitting right there, waiting. The roles had reversed. For 40 years, I'd been the caretaker, and now he was taking care of me. I cried that day, sitting in my doorway while he watched from a few feet away, understanding passing between us without words. We'd kept each other alive, kept each other company, given each other purpose. We weren't just woman and creature anymore. We were family. Last spring, he took me back to the cave behind the waterfall. We hadn't been there in years, both of us too old for the difficult hike. But he insisted, moving with determination despite his age and injury. When we arrived, I saw that he'd added something new to the carefully preserved burial site. In the back of the cave, next to where the others rested, he'd prepared a space for himself. Soft moss arranged in a bed, his few possessions, the water-smooth stones and carved wood pieces he'd collected over the years laid out nearby. He sat down in the spot and looked at me, and I understood what he was telling me. He knew he was the last one, the last of his kind in these mountains, possibly the last anywhere. When he died, an entire species would die with him, thousands of years of existence, of living in harmony with these forests, of surviving despite everything humans had done to eliminate them, would end. And he'd made peace with it, prepared for it, but he wanted someone to know. He wanted someone to witness and remember. That's when I finally understood the full weight of what he'd shown me over the years. This wasn't just about one creature's story or one family's tragedy. This was about the extinction of an entire species happening in real time, in silence, while the world went on not knowing or not caring. His fear of humans wasn't paranoia, it was learned behavior based on decades of violence. His hiding wasn't cowardice, it was survival. And his loneliness, the reason he'd stayed near me all these years, was because there was no one else left. I'm 73 years old now. He's old too, probably ancient by the standards of his kind. Some days he barely moves, just sits at the edge of the trees while I bring food he only picks at. Other days are better, and we'll sit together like we have for 40 years, comfortable in our silence. But I can see the end coming for both of us. Maybe him first, maybe me. Either way, our time is short. I've kept the secret my entire adult life. Never told anyone, never took photos, never tried to prove what I knew. I kept his existence hidden because that was the only way to keep him safe. But now I'm facing the reality that when we're both gone, no one will know. His species will vanish from the earth without acknowledgement, without record, without anyone understanding what was lost. The burden of this knowledge has been heavier than I expected, knowing that I'm one of perhaps a handful of people who truly understands what happened, who bears witness to a genocide that history will never record, changes you. I've watched the world celebrate conservation efforts, protect endangered species, create laws to prevent extinction. And all the while, I knew about a species that slipped through every protection, that died in silence while the world looked away. Sometimes I've been tempted to tell someone, to unburden myself, to share the weight of this secret. But every time I imagine doing so, I imagine the consequences, people coming to search for him. Scientists wanting to study him, hunters wanting to claim him as a trophy, media attention that would make his territory unsafe. Even well-meaning people who would want to protect him, would ultimately endanger him by acknowledging his existence. The only safe secret is a kept secret. I've also thought about what it means that his kind never sought help from humans, never tried to communicate or coexist. They chose invisibility, chose isolation, chose to fade away rather than risk interaction with us. That choice tells its own story. They watched us, learned our patterns, understood our capacity for violence, and decided that extinction was preferable to exposure. What does it say about humanity that an intelligent species would rather die out than make contact with us? The loneliness of being the last must be unbearable. I think about that often when I look at him. He spent 40 years as possibly the only one of his kind, carrying memories of a family and a culture that no longer exist, living in a world where everything familiar has been destroyed. The fact that he's survived at all, that he hasn't simply given up, speaks to a resilience I can barely comprehend. But survival isn't the same as living, and I've watched the light in his eyes dim over the years, not from age, but from the weight of being alone. That's why I'm sharing this now. Not to prove anything, I have no evidence to offer. Not to gain attention, I've protected my privacy too long to want that. But because someone needs to know that they existed, that they were real, intelligent, peaceful beings who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. That they were families with children and history and culture. That they were systematically hunted and killed, driven to extinction by fear and greed, and the human need to conquer everything we don't understand. They weren't monsters in the woods, they were people, just different from us. And we destroyed them for it. I still make my way out to our meeting spot every morning and evening. My legs aren't what they used to be, and the walk that once took 15 minutes now takes 40. But I make it. I bring his food, usually fruit and fish, things easy for him to eat in his weakened state. Most days he's already there, waiting. Sometimes he's brought something for me too, old habits, dying hard, a smooth stone, a bird feather, once a perfectly preserved pine cone. Our meetings have become quieter over the years. We sit together in the dappled sunlight, two beings at the end of their time, comfortable in silence. Sometimes I talk, telling him about my dreams or memories from decades ago. Other times we just exist together, sharing space without needing to fill it with sound. There's a peace in these moments, a sense of completion. We've lived our lives, kept each other company, witnessed things that shouldn't be possible. Now we're waiting for whatever comes next. I've noticed small changes in him recently that worry me. He sleeps more, moving less even during our time together. His breathing is sometimes labored, his massive chest working harder than it should. He eats less, picking at food that used to disappear immediately. These are the signs I've seen in other old creatures near the end. Part of me wants to deny it, to pretend we have more time, but I've lived long enough to recognize the truth when I see it. I've prepared as much as I can for the inevitable. I have detailed maps showing the locations of all the burial sites, sealed in waterproof containers, and hidden where they might someday be found by someone who will understand their significance. I've written down everything I remember about his people, their behaviors, their intelligence, their fate. Not this account, which is for the world if it wants to listen, but detailed scientific observations that might help future researchers understand what was lost. These documents are hidden with maps, a time capsule of extinction. My own preparations are simpler. I've arranged for my property to become part of a conservation trust, protected land that can never be developed. It's not much, just a few hundred acres, but it includes his territory, the places he's lived and hidden for 40 years. When I'm gone, at least those places will be safe, at least for a while. It's a small gesture, inadequate, really, but it's all I can do. We sit together in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. I tell him about my day, about the weather, about memories from years ago. I don't know how much he understands, but he listens. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, watch me with that same intelligence I first saw 40 years ago in the snow. The intelligence that told me he was worth saving, worth protecting, worth knowing. Sometimes I think about what will happen after he's gone, after I'm gone. I've made arrangements to protect the burial sites, vague instructions in my will about preserving certain areas of the forest, though I can't explain why. Maybe someday someone will find the caves, will see the bones, and understand what they represent. Or maybe the forest will reclaim everything, and his people will rest undisturbed for eternity. I've thought about whether there might be others still hiding in remote corners of the world, deep in the Himalayas, in the vast forests of Siberia, in the unexplored regions of the Pacific Northwest, beyond where we've been. I hope there are. I hope his kind didn't go completely extinct, that somewhere families still live in peace, still raise their children, still leave gifts for each other in forest clearings, but I don't know. And neither does he. We're probably both hoping for something that doesn't exist anymore. I've promised him, though he can't understand the words, that I'll protect the burial sites after he's gone, that I'll make sure no one disturbs the resting places of his people, that their bones, the last physical evidence of their existence, will remain sacred and hidden. It's the least I can do after 40 years of friendship, after everything he's shown me, after the trust he placed in me when he had every reason to fear. When my time comes, and I know it's coming soon, I've left instructions that my ashes be scattered in the forest. Not in any specific place, just scattered where the wind takes them. Maybe some small part of me will find its way to where he rests, and we'll be in the forest together one last time. It's a foolish thought, maybe, but it brings me comfort. I think about legacy, about what we leave behind. I have no children, no family. My legacy is a secret kept, a species protected for as long as I could manage it. A friendship that shouldn't have been possible, but was. Maybe that's enough. Maybe bearing witness to his existence, to his people's story, to the terrible truth of what was done to them. Maybe that matters even if no one else ever knows. 40 years of knowing him has taught me things I never expected to learn. About fear and trust, about survival and extinction. about the consequences of being different in a world that doesn't tolerate difference. His people didn't die out because they were weak or unintelligent. They died out because they were peaceful, because they chose to hide rather than fight, because they underestimated human capacity for violence against anything we don't understand. I've learned that intelligence and awareness aren't uniquely human traits. He thinks, he feels, he remembers, he grieves. He makes decisions based on experience and understanding. He has preferences and dislikes, habits and rituals, memories that shape his behavior. In every way that matters, he's a person, just not a human person. And the fact that the world would never acknowledge that personhood, would never grant him the protection and respect that recognition would bring, is one of the great moral failures of our species. I've learned that extinction isn't always a natural process. Sometimes it's murder, systematic and deliberate, carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The hunters who killed his family weren't defending themselves. They were seeking trophies, bounties, proof of their prowess. The people who organized those expeditions knew they were hunting intelligent beings and did it anyway. The governments that seized evidence and maintained official denial were complicit in genocide. Everyone involved made choices, and those choices led to the elimination of an entire species. I've learned that keeping a secret can be an act of love. Every day for 40 years, I've chosen his safety over my desire to share this incredible experience. I've chosen his life over the fame or recognition I might have gained from revealing his existence. I've chosen to bear the weight of this knowledge alone rather than risk exposing him. And I would make the same choice again every single time, because some things are more important than personal satisfaction or public acknowledgement. Most importantly, I've learned that fear can be rational, justified, and tragic all at once. His fear of humans isn't paranoia or instinct. It's learned behavior based on centuries of violence, a survival strategy that worked until there was nothing left to survive for. His people feared us because they understood us, because they recognized what we're capable of doing to anything that threatens our sense of supremacy. And they were right to fear us. Their extinction proves it. This morning, like every morning, I made my way out to our spot. He was there, sitting in his usual place, the morning sun catching the gray in his fur. I set down his breakfast, apples and salmon, and sat on my log across from him. We stayed there for an hour, just being together, two old souls at the end of their time. Before I left, he did something he rarely does anymore. He stood up slowly and with effort and walked closer to me than he usually comes. He reached out one massive hand and gently touched my shoulder just for a moment. In that touch was everything we couldn't say to each other. Thank you. I understand. We made it this far together. It's been an honor. So now you know. You know that they were real, that they lived in our world while staying hidden from it, that they were hunted to extinction by humans who feared what they didn't understand. You know that at least one of them found kindness instead of cruelty, trust instead of betrayal, a peaceful end instead of a violent one. And you know that somewhere in the Pacific Northwest mountains, an old woman still brings food every day to a being that shouldn't exist, keeping a promise made 40 years ago in the snow. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. I have no proof to offer, no evidence beyond my word. The bones are hidden, the newspaper clippings are sealed away, the photographs show only shadows and distant shapes. I could have fabricated all of this, created an elaborate fiction for reasons I can't quite explain. But I'm telling you it's true, every word of it, and I'm trusting that someone, somewhere, will understand why this needed to be told. Maybe there are others still out there, hiding in remote corners of the world where humans rarely venture. Deep wilderness in Canada, or Russia, or the Himalayas, Places where a careful, intelligent creature could still avoid detection, I hope so. I hope his kind didn't go completely extinct, that somewhere families still live in peace, still pass down their knowledge, still leave gifts for each other in forest clearings. But hope isn't knowledge, and I'll never know for certain. What I do know is that one of them trusted me. Against all his experience, against every survival instinct his kind had developed over centuries of persecution, he chose to trust one human. He let me into his life, showed me his history, shared his grief with me. And in return, I've kept him safe as long as I could, given him companionship in his final years. And now I'm telling his story so that when we're both gone, someone will remember. We're both waiting now, waiting for the inevitable, for the final chapter to close, for the story to end. But until then, I'll keep bringing food. He'll keep leaving gifts, and we'll sit together in the forest we both love, two unlikely friends at the end of the world. That's the truth about why they fear us. Not because they're monsters and we're heroes, but because we're the monsters, and they knew it long before I did. For more interesting stories, check this out.